In this video, I would like to introduce some advanced uses of functions. You are not required to use these features in your assignment, however, you may. We can use functions to increase the efficiency of our applications. Functions can be used to shorten the amount of code we need to write, to eliminate repetitive code, for automating repetitive tasks, and also to return values. So I will demonstrate how this can be accomplished in this video. I would like to also discuss the use strict directive. This is a directive that would be placed at the top of your JavaScript code, which enables us to write more secure JavaScript. JavaScript can accept bad syntax, which could turn into an error if we're not careful, and use strict helps us to prevent that. This is an example. In our script tag, we have the use script directive. Underneath, I have x equals 3. So we are assigning the value of 3 to x, and that is okay, kind of, and it does work. You should always use the keyword var when first declaring a variable. Although this works, it allows this variable to become what is called a global variable, meaning that if it were defined inside a function, you would have access to that anywhere. That would not necessarily be a problem unless you had several variables of the same name. By using the use strict directive, you see that in our developer tools, we are receiving an error message, and it tells us that there is a problem so that we would correct it by using the var keyword. We have already looked at this function being used in the current edition of the textbook to return an object reference. So here we have a text box with an ID of first name. In order to retrieve the value in that text box, we need to use document.getElementById and then the ID value, the value property. Although that's not that complicated to write and the editor will enter that for you, it's a lot of code to continually write in order to access that ID object reference. This dollar function, which is being stored in a variable, takes one parameter, and that is the ID that we will be using. So rather than say document.getElementById, I can substitute that whole expression with this dollar sign, shorten my expression, and I can retrieve the value. So notice we have the function being defined, which would be defined globally in our script tag, and wherever we need to use that function, here is the function call, and the function is being called by using this dollar sign. Personally, I do not think a dollar sign is a good name for a function, so maybe it's a good idea to use something more meaningful, such as getID. So therefore, when you see this function being called getID first name, you know that this expression is doing the same thing as document.getElementById first name in much fewer amount of letters. And it's a little bit more easy to work with if we can shorten the expressions used to access different parts of our application. Functions can be very effective when we're doing repetitive tasks. For example, here we have a text box. And how we would access that text box, document.getElementById, the ID value, .value. So the value property will give us the value of the text box, and we're storing it in a variable. Now, I only have one text box, but in reality, you might have 10, give or take. And if you needed to check every value, you would need to go through the same routine. In this case, we're checking for a valid number. So here's our if condition. We're saying if is not a number, which is a built-in JavaScript function. We pass it the argument the width, which is pointing us to the value in that text box. So we're saying if the value in that text box is not a valid number, or the value in that text box is less than or equal to 0, we're going to give the user an error message. Now, there's nothing wrong with writing this 5 or 6 times. However, I would like to show you how we can consolidate that into a function. So here we have a function, and I'm going to call it check number. Why? Because it's checking the number. Makes sense. This function will take a parameter. So I'm using the word num as the placeholder name for my parameter. So this function is essentially executing the same code as above. It's the same if condition. If is not a number, but rather than hard coding in a variable name, I'm passing it the same parameter num. And here we're checking to see if it's less than or equal to 0. Again, rather than hard coding in the variable name, I'm passing it a parameter. So these are placeholders for the value that we will pass to it eventually. Here we have the function, which is doing the same thing as our above if condition. Now let's see how we use that function. Here's our text box. Here we are retrieving the value, storing it in a variable called the width. At the top of our script tag, this is our function defined. Here we have the function call. The name of the function is check number. We pass it the argument to be checked, which is the variable name the width, which holds the value in that text box. So this is the argument being passed to this function. So this value is being passed up here to the parameter placeholder num. So now num has the value of the width. Wherever this variable num is, that value will be passed. So essentially what we're doing is we're checking the width, and again we're checking the width. But rather than coding if is not a number or number is less than or equal to 0 over and over again, we can call one function and pass it a value. I would like to point out that if the code inside the if statement condition returns true, the code inside the curly braces will execute. So in this case, if it's not a valid number, it indeed will return true. In that case, when we actually call the function, we could give the user an error message. So if there's a problem with this number, we give the user an error message, and they have to go back to fix it. However, it doesn't give us the ability to actually use that number at this point. Now we will redefine our function by adding an else clause. We are actually going to place a return false inside our if. So if there's a problem with this number, the if will return true, and therefore return false will be called, and that will stop the execution of the code. So if there's a problem, we can stop the execution of the code. We can also give the user an error message. However, if there's not a problem, meaning if the if statement is not true, meaning it is a valid number, then we are going to use the return keyword and return num. So if it's a valid number, this function will return a valid number. If not, it will return false, and we can give the user an error message at that point. So we have just changed our function definition a little bit. Now let's take a look at the function call, because we want to give the user an error message if there's a problem. And in the function, we have a return false. So how do we do that? We do that by using the not symbol. This is very commonly done in JavaScript. We will have a function checking for something, and we'll check to see if it is not valid. So here in my if not check number the width, meaning if this is not going to return a valid number, then we know there's a problem, and in that case, we're going to give the user an error message. So we're using not check number for the error message. All right, well then, how do we use that number? So here's our function again, and now we have two text boxes. We have the width and the height. So we have two variables, the width and the height. And we would have two functions checking to see if they're valid numbers. And once they pass the test and they are valid, meaning there are no more error messages, then we want to perform the calculations and write the result to the page. So how do we do that? We do that with our check number function. Remember, check number will return the number. This expression right here, check number the width, is going to return that number from our function. And this check number function, the height, will return the value of the height from our function. So we have two function calls in our if condition. And what we are saying, if check number the width and check number the height. So we have a function that will return the value of the height and return the value of the width. They both have to be valid numbers because we are using the AND logical operator. Remember, our function is set up to return the number if it is a valid number. If you remember from the previous week, we learned how to use a true-false variable as a flag to determine when to write the values to the page. In this situation, we really don't have to do that because we are returning false if there's a problem and at the same time giving an error message. So the test as to when we write the values to the page once we perform the calculations is part of our function here. Finally, we will look at using a function for repetitive tasks. So here we see our application. We have the width and the height and two buttons. When we click the Get Area button, we want to validate that these are valid numbers. If not, we give the user an error message. The user, after seeing the error messages, will go back in and enter a valid number, hopefully. So every time the user enters a valid number, they have to click the Get Area button in order to check the values and ultimately write out the message. So every time we click the Get Area button, we first want to clear out the error messages and clear out the result so that our application looks professional. You don't want messages on your page that are not relevant to what the user is currently doing. We also have a Clear All button, and the Clear All button will clear out everything. It makes sense. If I click Clear All, it should clear everything. It should clear out any remaining error messages, it should clear out the width and the height, and it should clear out the result. So it's clearing out three things. Do we have an overlap here? Yes. Each button is clearing out error messages and result, and each button is calling an individual function. So rather than repeating the code to clear out the error message and to clear out the results in each function, we can write a separate function to do that, and then we will call that separate function in the other two functions. So let's take a look at how we do this. The Get Area button, when we click it, will call the Get Area function. So here we see the function Get Area. And at the very top of the Get Area function, here we have the Clear Message function. Well, what is the Clear Message function? This is my new function that I just wrote that clears out my error messages and my result. And notice how this function is called. So here we have an example of a function call within another function call. Now we're going to do the same thing for the Clear All button. Again, here is our Clear Message function, which clears out three different areas of messages on our page. However, we also need to clear out the width and the height. So in our Clear All function, we have two statements to clear out the width and the height, and then we have our function call. So now you can see how you can call a function within a function and how valuable it can be for repetitive tasks.